When 10-year-old Amber Barker climbed aboard her blue 10-speed bike, she was expected to arrive home in 10 to 15 minutes. Leaving the house of a friend, she had a ride of just over half a mile through her northwestern Oklahoma City neighborhood, but she never made it. When her mother was unable to locate the child, she contacted police and a massive search effort was launched. Within 24 hours, dozens of police and more than 30 FBI agents were on the scene and working the case, theorizing that Amber had been the victim of an abduction. Over the course of the next 72 hours, they would find Amber's bike and several pieces of her clothing strewn along the main roadway she'd been riding on. As evidence began paving the path forward, investigators turned their attention towards a man closely associated with Amber's family. However, he would disappear himself, only to be found dead days later, hanging from a tree in a local park. This act devastated the investigation, but years later, detectives revealed they were now in possession of a partial DNA profile from some of Amber's clothing. They have yet to find a match, but they have also made it clear that they know there are people out there who know exactly what happened to Amber Barker. This is Trace Evidence, episode 241, The Disappearance of Amber Barker. Welcome to Trace Evidence. I'm your host, Stephen Pacheco. Today we examine the disturbing and frustrating disappearance of 10-year-old Amber Barker from Oklahoma City in 1997. Between the evidence collected and the actions and statements of those around the child, many thought the case would be solved quickly. Yet nearly 3 decades later, the truth has yet to be revealed and Amber has never been found. Though I will avoid unnecessary detail, be advised this episode involves discussion of a child abduction, sexual assault, domestic violence, and suicide. This is episode 241, The Disappearance of Amber Barker. With temperatures dropping and the hour growing late, 10-year-old Amber Barker picked up the phone at her friend's house and called home. Worried that she'd be in trouble for staying out later than usual, the child spoke to her mother, Bonnie, who noted that it was supper time and she should head home immediately. Climbing onto her pale blue 10-speed bike, Amber began pedaling towards home as the last lingering remnants of sunlight peeked through the thin gaps between homes and businesses in her northwest Oklahoma City neighborhood. It would be a short trip, traveling just 6 blocks south to the family home. It was a ride she'd made dozens of times before, and she was highly familiar with her route. At that time of day and traveling along neighborhood roads running parallel to major roadways, it was a venture that normally took the child no more than 10 minutes, and yet she'd never arrive. Instead, the 10-year-old would mysteriously vanish somewhere within the half-mile between the two homes. Strangely, despite hundreds of houses with thousands of windows, not a single person would recall seeing Amber, her bike, or anything that might help provide answers. Hours later, law enforcement would descend upon the neighborhood in great numbers, probing into the child's disappearance. They combed the surrounding area, established roadblocks, and questioned local residents. They showed photos of the girl to passers-by, hoping that someone might be able to offer some insight or point them in a direction. They were frustrated by a lack of sightings, a lack of witnesses, and all the while highly aware of how important those first hours were. The trail would only become more difficult to follow as the hours passed. Eventually, though, they would come upon a series of clues that carried them further and further away from where Amber had last been known to be. Each item uncovered became another foreboding piece of evidence, confirming to investigators just how important it was to proceed with haste, as it was a race against the odds and time was quickly dwindling. Amber Renee Barker was born on Wednesday, October 14, 1987, to parents Bonnie and Robert Parker in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. Bonnie and Robert, who had married 20 years earlier in 1967, were on the downslope of their marriage and both knew it. While Amber would be their final child together, her birth would come less than 2 months before their divorce was finalized on Wednesday, December 9th. Though they would continue to co-parent, their relationship had worn thin, and the two often found themselves arguing were they in the same room together for too long. While most of the children were old enough to understand the situation, Amber would grow up in a world having never seen her parents together happily, and while she lived with Bonnie, she spent a lot of time with her father as well. Amber, or Amby as most in her family called her, was a sweet, kind, and fun-loving child who seemingly had an interest in everything. Bonnie noted that her daughter loved riding bikes and had a special place in her heart when it came to animals, sometimes talking about an interest in growing up and being a veterinarian. Robert, who worked as a welder and was good with his hands, would later report that his daughter was a chip off the old block. He explained that she loved working on cars with him in the driveway and spoke of one day becoming a welder, just like him. He described Amber as somewhat of a tomboy. She enjoyed getting grease under her nails and had a lot of fun spray painting, but she also loved her dolls and dressing up. One thing was for sure, Amber was a smart and inquisitive child who wasn't afraid to try something for the first time. At home, she could be quiet and reserved, but she loved chatting with her siblings and spending time with her mother. The two would often cuddle together on the couch to watch TV or take a nap. According to Bonnie, her daughter was often afraid of being in the dark of her bedroom at night, so it was very common to find her sleeping on the couch. This was a habit that would continue over the next few years of her life, and even following her 10th birthday in October of '97, that fear of being alone in her bed at night still lingered. Tragically, she would never have the opportunity to outgrow her concerns, as less than 2 months later, she would vanish from the streets of her own neighborhood. Perhaps, some wondered in retrospect, she had had a legitimate reason to be afraid. By the fall of '97, Amber was living with her mother at 3119 Northwest 39th Terrace, in a 768-square-foot red brick house with 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and an attached garage. It was the best Bonnie could afford to rent at the time, as she was in financial straits and struggling to keep their heads above water, but Amber never complained. She loved the home she shared with her mother and was seemingly unaware or unperturbed by the money challenges her mother faced. No one can say for sure. But one thing that is certain is that Amber loved going to school. By this time, she was a 4th grader attending James Monroe Elementary School just a mile away on North Lynn Avenue to the northeast. According to teachers and classmates, Amber was by all accounts a good student and friend, and she was active in her classes and extracurricular activities. She always did her homework, asked interesting questions, and tried to help others when they needed it. She made friends easily with what has been described as a gentle sense of humor, warm personality, and an interest in making others feel good about themselves. When she wasn't working on a project, drawing pictures at her desk, or reading, her favorite activity was being the hall monitor. She loved throwing on the sash, guiding others, and just being a part of the school. She was a happy child with a bright future that she would never have the chance to realize. This takes us to the afternoon of Thursday, December 18th, 1997. 1 week until Christmas, Amber's favorite holiday, and she was growing increasingly more excited with each passing day. She'd spent hours earlier in the week helping to decorate the artificial tree she had selected for the home that year. Tying off ribbons and hanging ornaments, she was elated to celebrate Christmas, not just for the gifts, but to be able to spend time with her sisters, brothers, and of course, her mother Bonnie. On this particular day, Amber awoke as she normally did, dressed, ate a small breakfast, and then slung her backpack on and headed off to school. Not only did she love the holidays at home, she loved them at school as well, since they often worked on fun projects and she could create handmade gifts for her parents and siblings. According to everything reported about this case, Amber's day at school went off without a hitch, and after being released, she went back to the family home along Northwest 39th Terrace. There's never been a clear explanation as to what happened next, but we know at some point that Amber hopped on her blue 10-speed bike and made the quick 10 to 15-minute ride north. Generally speaking, Amber took the same path that she always did. Leaving her driveway, she'd turn left and travel approximately 300 feet east to the intersection of 39th Terrace and North Drexel Boulevard. She would spend the bulk of her trip on Drexel, traveling north for 0.3 of a mile. From there, she'd turn left again, heading west along Northwest 43rd Street for 0.2 of a mile. Turning right, she'd head north again, this time along North Hamilton Drive, taking it for 2 blocks. There, she'd turn right, heading west along Northwest 45th Street to arrive at the home of her friend and classmate Katie Kelly, located at 3041 Northwest 45th. No one seems to know for certain, or at least if they do, it's never been reported, what time Amber left home and went to visit her friend Katie. This adds in some confusion, as it will be reported multiple times in the early days of the investigation that Amber had stayed out past curfew that night and was afraid she'd be in trouble when she got home. Now, whether she purposefully broke curfew, lost track of time, or thought she was allowed to stay out later, no one can seemingly confirm or deny. What we do know is that at approximately 5:45 p.m., Amber used the phone at her friend's house and called her mother. After speaking for a few minutes, Bonnie instructed her daughter to come home for the evening, and Amber stated that she would get on her bike and leave as soon as she hung up. According to the Kelly family, they last saw Amber climbing onto her bike and riding away 5 minutes later at 5:50 p.m. This will be the last confirmed sighting of Amber Barker. For reasons no one ever took the time to clarify, Bonnie would later tell the Daily Oklahoman that when she spoke to her daughter on the phone that final time, she had a dark premonition that something terrible was going to happen. She explained, quote, "I thought I'm never going to see her again. I was worried the whole time," end quote. According to Bonnie, when Amber didn't make it home in the next 15 minutes, she grew increasingly concerned. Around 6:20, approximately 30 minutes after Amber left her friend's house, Bonnie stated she began driving around the neighborhood, covering the area between the two homes in search of Amber, but she couldn't find the 10-year-old. Early reports say that after she failed to locate her daughter, Bonnie returned home and made several calls to friends, but none of them had seen the child either. She then called the Oklahoma City Police Department to report Amber missing. The exact time of this call has been somewhat contested, as early reports say Bonnie called at 6:30 p.m., 10 minutes after leaving to go look for Amber. But later reports adjust the timing, saying it actually came into dispatch at 7:20 p.m., an hour after she had started searching. Sergeant Kyle Webb was one of the first investigators on the scene, and he would later report to the media that, while they didn't have any evidence of a crime, they didn't think Amber would have run away, noting she had never done so before and wasn't the type to get into trouble. Sergeant Webb described Amber to reporters as being 5 feet tall, weighing 80 pounds, and having long brown hair. At the time, it was said she was wearing a long-sleeve beige shirt with a brown collar, black jeans, and tennis shoes. He also relayed a description of her blue 10-speed bike. The search for Amber began quickly that night, with patrol units notified to cover the entire area between the two houses, while detectives spoke with the family, neighbors, and the last people to have seen the 10-year-old alive. Unfortunately, while the investigation had kicked off quickly, it was already dark out and growing colder as temperatures dropped from the mid-60s to the low 50s. They would have no luck tracking down Amber that night, but by the morning of Friday, December 19th, the Oklahoma City Police Department would dramatically increase the numbers of officers involved in the search. They would also be joined by 35 FBI agents, as well as concerned neighbors who volunteered to assist. The involvement of the FBI early on made it quite apparent that investigators believed foul play was involved. Dan Vogel, spokesman for the FBI, would confirm this, telling the Oklahoman, quote, "We are handling this as an abduction case now. We will do everything we can to locate this young lady," end quote. The FBI would go on to deploy Rapid Start, a computer system and database set up at the command post established for the investigation. The software allows for both FBI agents and local law enforcement to enter information including tips, clues, and leads, which the system then organizes and assigns investigators to follow up on. While law enforcement were setting up their command post and beginning to organize a massive search of the area, now expanded to include several blocks north and south of the original area, Amber's family were putting themselves to good use. Her father, Robert, who lived in Chandler, 50 miles northeast of the city, arrived in town early and was at Bonnie's home helping out in any way he could. Having created flyers displaying a photo of the missing child and the details of her disappearance, different groups of family members set themselves up at different intersections in the area where they handed out the flyers, spoke to passersby, and hoped to obtain information about potential sightings. Joan Barker, one of Amber's aunts, set up shop right at the corner of 39th and Drexel, just a few hundred feet from the family home. Not long into the day, she spoke to a man who reported that he had seen a little girl on a bike, fitting Amber's description, on the day of her disappearance in the area of the Drexel condominiums, located at 4000 North Drexel Boulevard. By way of Drexel, this sighting placed Amber approximately 500 feet northeast of her home, or 330 feet as the crow flies. Now, while police ran with this sighting, reports in the media that Amber was seen on North Drexel add some confusion. The witness stated he saw this girl on a bike speaking to a young boy who was selling candy in front of the condos. However, he timed this sighting as taking place at 5:25, at least 20 minutes before Amber called home from her friend's house, 5.5 blocks north of the condos. I could find no explanation for this discrepancy. While this sighting gave investigators a direction to look at more closely, it didn't really provide them with too much assistance. Units were dispatched to the condos where they searched the area in question residents, but it doesn't appear that anything was learned, nor were there any additional sightings. While investigators were frustrated by the lack of developments, they would soon come into possession of a new piece of evidence which would dramatically shift the focus of their search. At approximately 10:37 a.m. on Friday, a patrol officer radioed in that they had found Amber's bike. The blue 10-speed was described as being in good shape and showing no signs of damage or anything which might suggest that an accident had occurred. The discovery was the first major finding in the case, but what really blew investigators' minds was where it had been found. Amber's bike was located leaning against a tree in Denniston Park, 14 blocks south, just shy of 2 miles, from her home on Northwest 39th Terrace. The small park is bordered by Northwest 27th to the north, Northwest 24th to the south, Denniston Drive to the east, and North Drexel Boulevard to the west. According to investigators, the bike was found closest to the intersection of Drexel and 25. Investigators were baffled by the finding, noting that all of their previous searches had been conducted far north of the park. While they had focused on a 6-square-block area previously, they would now have to expand, and since the bike had been found so far south from where they'd originally looked, they dispatched units to begin searching south of the park along Drexel and neighboring roads. Captain Chuck Allen of the Oklahoma City Police couldn't quite understand what they were working with, as he noted to reporters that, for Amber to have gone to the park herself, she'd have had to have passed her own house, which just didn't make any sense. Asked at the time if they thought Amber had made the trip of her own choice, Allen was unable to speculate, but noted 2 miles was a rather long bike ride for a 10-year-old to make, especially when they had found nothing to suggest she planned to go anywhere other than home. Another item alleged to belong to Amber would be found this same day, although in a very different location. Reportedly, one of Amber's sisters found a small silver ring not far from Katie Kelly's home. The place of this discovery is noted as being the intersection of North Drexel and Northwest 45th Street, but strangely, Drexel doesn't extend that far north and instead terminates where it intersects with Northwest 43rd. Whether they actually meant North Drexel and 43, or if they mistakenly said Drexel when they meant North Hamilton and 45, has never been explained or corrected. I should also note, while the ring is mentioned as being found, it is never publicly incorporated into the official list of evidence recovered. Friday was an emotional day, not just for the family and investigators, but for Amber's friends. It was the last day of school before the Christmas break, and students were very upset with their friend's disappearance. Counselors were brought in to comfort the children and to advise them about how to handle if they are approached by a stranger. Police also arrived at the school to speak with teachers and friends of Amber's that might be able to provide some insight. Though a long shot, investigators were also sent to nearby Madison Elementary School, where they asked students about areas around town where children might hang out that their parents may be unaware of. Police cruisers were seen all around town, parked by storm drains, culverts, and canals, as they were searching out of the way and out of sight locations for potential clues. Just before midnight, they would find one. A woman living along North Drexel contacted police just prior to midnight, informing them that she had discovered what appeared to be a child's shoe. Dispatched to the intersection of Drexel and Northwest 12th Street, investigators took the shoe into evidence, and it was later confirmed by the family that it did in fact belong to Amber. This location is 27 blocks south from Amber's home and 13 blocks south from where the bike had been found in Denniston Park. At this point, Captain Allen stated to the media that they would be searching around the area when the sun came up on Saturday morning, and he also advised residents in the area not to touch any potential evidence, but simply to contact police and point it out to them, as they didn't want to run the risk of contaminating forensic examinations. At approximately 9 a.m., police officers searching in the surrounding area where the shoe had been found came upon its missing mate. The second shoe was located 1 block north at Drexel and Northwest 13th Street. In hopes of obtaining more information, the FBI set up several roadblocks in the area and stopped and questioned residents and passers-by, showing them photos of Amber and asking if they had seen her or anything out of the ordinary in the previous days. The Oklahoma City Police widened their search area once again, now running 35 blocks north to south between Northwest 45 and Northwest 10, and 6 blocks east to west from North May Avenue to Lake Hefner Parkway, an area equivalent to 1.64 square miles. Captain Charles Allen, speaking to the media, noted that 5:50 p.m. marked 48 hours that Amber had been missing, and while they were beyond the critical first 2 days, he remained optimistic that they would find and safely recover the missing 10-year-old. For their part, the FBI were a little less positive, with spokesman Dan Vogel telling Tulsa World, quote, "The more time that goes by, the investigation gets harder and harder. We are getting information from witnesses, and we are following up on that at this time." End quote. On Sunday, December 21st, investigators called in the local media to announce the discovery of another piece of evidence and to ask for the public's assistance in locating someone they believed might possess information about Amber's whereabouts. Investigators stated that on Saturday, at approximately 1:40 p.m., they had recovered Amber's long-sleeved beige shirt near some bushes at the intersection of Drexel and Northwest 15th. In addition, they stated that they had recovered a sock that might have belonged to the child, but they couldn't at that time confirm it. That puts the shirt, or sweater as it is sometimes described, 2 and 3 blocks north from where the shoes were found and 10 blocks south from where the bike was located. Detectives also announced that they were on the search for 24-year-old Daniel John Smith. Smith was described as being the common-law husband of Amber's sister Debbie, with whom he shared a 6-month-old daughter. Though law enforcement would not refer to Smith as a suspect, they did state that it was urgent they locate and speak with him about the disappearance. Smith had been interviewed by detectives on Thursday, hours after the disappearance, but when they uncovered additional evidence and returned to question him a second time, they couldn't find him. Reportedly, in the previous months, Smith's relationship with Debbie had begun turning bad, and she, in an attempt to escape, took their daughter and fled to the state of Oregon, where there were family connections from her father's side. Reportedly, on November 30th, less than a month before Amber's disappearance, police were called to a home in the 2400 block of Northwest 35th Street, where Debbie was reportedly staying at the time. She informed police that after refusing to have sex with Smith, he had become violent and assaulted her. Smith was not arrested at the time, but was given a citation. It was shortly after this incident that Debbie was reported to have left the state. It was also reported that Smith believed Debbie was still in the area and frequently stopped by the family house looking for any signs of her. Smith had a troubled history when it came to law enforcement and was actually on parole for a crime that involved kidnapping. 2 years earlier, on Sunday, April 23, 1995, Smith was arrested for attacking an Oklahoma City woman. The woman testified that when she came out of a club in the early morning hours, Smith was crouched down beside her driver's side door. He pulled the door open, and when she tried to flee, he forced her back into the vehicle, at which time he grabbed her by the throat and began striking her. The witness went on to state that she believed the man was trying to sexually assault her, and ultimately, she had managed to fight him off and fled from the vehicle on foot. Smith admitted to attacking the woman, though he claimed he wasn't trying to rape her. Instead, he told police that he was drunk and was trying to get his hands on her keys so he could steal her car. Originally, he was to be charged with only robbery, but that charge was upgraded to kidnapping, which carried a longer and more severe maximum sentence. An additional charge of intimidating a state's witness was added in when, following testimony from a bouncer at the club, Smith threatened him in the courtroom, saying, quote, "As soon as I get out, you're a dead man," end quote. Smith would go on to plead guilty to kidnapping, but rather than being sent to prison to serve his sentence, which carried a 10-year maximum, Smith was sent to complete a 4-month boot camp program for young adults at the William S. Key Correctional Center in Fort Supply, 150 miles northwest of Oklahoma City. The charge of intimidation was dropped as part of the plea bargain, and so Smith's future would be determined based upon how he behaved while at the boot camp. He performed well, was rated as excellent, and obtained his GED equivalency while there. The district attorney's office would go on to recommend that Smith receive a 5-year suspended sentence. In November of '96, District Judge Freeman sentenced Smith to 5 years of probation, but then he made it a deferred sentence. That meant that if Smith completed all of the terms set out by the judge, he wouldn't have a criminal record. The judge ordered Smith to attend weekly Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, undergo counseling, maintain a part-time job, and meet with his parole officer once a month. According to the Oklahoman, Smith had a rough upbringing, being raised in foster care after being removed from his biological mother at the age of 6. He was a high school dropout who had last attended school at the age of 15 and who would fall into a long and difficult history with drug and alcohol abuse. Investigators noted that an arrest warrant had been issued for Smith for violating the terms of his parole since he had failed to attend his required AA meeting. They went on to state that Smith's last known address was at 4312 Butler Place, just 2 miles east of Amber's house. Smith was described as being 5 feet 4 inches tall and 150 pounds with brown hair and hazel eyes. Police noted that he was driving a 1987 silver Mitsubishi pickup with black pinstripes, a blue interior, a smoky exhaust, and slightly tinted windows. There were dents on the driver's side door, and the vehicle had Oklahoma plates. At the time, police would not go into detail about Smith's potential connection to or knowledge of Amber's disappearance. Sadly, they would never obtain any answers from Smith. Late on Sunday night, police located Smith's Mitsubishi pickup parked at a gas station convenience store at 7727 South Sunny Lane Road. The next day, Monday, December 22nd, police and volunteers from a nearby neighborhood gathered together and began conducting a search at Ray Trent Park, 12 miles south from Amber's home and just north of Interstate 40. It wasn't a long search, as at approximately 11:30 a.m., police came upon the lifeless body of Daniel John Smith. Smith was hanging from a tree overlooking Crutchco Creek. The medical examiner would later determine the cause of death as suicide by hanging, with the autopsy report showing both antidepressants and methamphetamines in Smith's blood. While Smith was still not being referred to as a suspect, It was fairly apparent at the time that investigators believed he might be able to provide some answers about their search for Amber. His death severely hindered their investigation, as the one name they had reason to want to pursue was now scratched out. Following his death, law enforcement reported that Smith had allegedly threatened Amber in the days leading up to her disappearance, but at the time, they would not give further details. As Christmas approached, the optimism investigators had previously displayed was shrinking quickly, and it was becoming disturbingly clear that without Smith, there were few other avenues to pursue. Sadly, Christmas, Amber's favorite holiday, would come and go with no new leads or developments. Presents meant for the missing child remained under the tree she had decorated, untouched, as her mother hoped to give them to the 10-year-old when she was found and brought home safely. Bonnie, in desperation, made a plea to the person who took her daughter, begging for her return. She explained, quote, "Whoever has gotten her, please don't hurt her. Just let her go. She would not do anything to hurt you. Please don't hurt her." End quote. While investigators had zeroed in on Smith, there was some discussion about the possibility that more than one person had been involved in the abduction. Among those considering multiple assailants was Amber's father, Robert. He explained to the Oklahoman, saying, quote, "I have not given up because we seem to think there were other people involved. She still could be alive. I know it's not looking very good right now, but he had to go somewhere after he snatched her up." End quote. On Friday, December 26th, divers from the Oklahoma City Fire Department were deployed to Ray Trent Park, where they walked along shallow creek beds and searched through the Crutchgo Creek for any new evidence, whether it be related to Smith's death or Amber's disappearance, but ultimately, nothing was found. They moved on to the area between the interstate and Sunny Lane Road, but found nothing there either. Investigators with the local police noted that they would be increasing the amount of officers assigned to the case and working through the holidays, while the FBI increased their number of agents from 35 to 40. Chief Allen announced that a reward fund for information had been established and would be handled through Crime Stoppers. The chief also told reporters that evidence they had previously collected, namely Amber's bike and articles of her clothing, had been sent off for forensic testing, noting that blood and quote-unquote other substances had been found on some of the items. Asked about Smith or any potential suspects, Chief Allen stated they had not ruled anyone out up to that point, up to and including the family. The year of 1997 would come to an end with the case only beginning to grow cold. While calls were coming in with tips, they didn't appear to lead anywhere helpful. In early January, an affidavit filed by police in order to obtain a search warrant for Smith's truck was unsealed, and a lot of new information was learned. According to 19-year-old Joseph Bishop, a friend of the family, he was at Bonnie's house the evening Amber went missing. The affidavit stated that Bishop told investigators that Daniel John Smith was also present in the house that day, and that both of them were there when Amber called and was told to come home. Bishop alleged that as soon as the call ended, Smith left the house, and rather than turning east, the direction of his apartment, as he usually did, he turned right, heading west. Now, the affidavit notes that west is the direction Amber would be coming home from, but that's not exactly accurate. The Kelly home is basically directly north of the Barker house, and you can go east or west to reach roads that will take you there. In fact, North Drexel that Amber is reported to have used that day is east of the house. I understand in the affidavit they're trying to lay out as much of a case as they can to pin down Smith as a likely suspect, but the neighborhood is gridded by dozens of roads. You could leave the Barker house by either direction, and the only difference would be a mere 0.2 of a mile's travel. Bizarrely, Bonnie told police that this information was incorrect, and that Smith was not at her home when the call had come in. She claimed that Smith left prior to Amber's call, but, and here's the really frustrating thing, Smith himself confirmed to police that he was there and that he overheard that phone call. Why would Bonnie lie about this? Well, it won't be the last time someone in the Barker family steps up to try and provide some coverage and support for Daniel John Smith. The affidavit went on to state that during his interview with police, Smith said that when he left the Barker home, he was actually searching for the vehicle of his estranged common-law wife, Debbie. Unable to find it, Smith told police that he then went to a club and started drinking beer. After leaving the club, he bought more beer and started driving around while drinking. It was during this interview that investigators decided to confront Smith with information that had been delivered to them from Amber's father, as well as her brother, Eddie, who was 11 at the time. According to both of them, the day prior to her disappearance, Wednesday, December 17th, Amber confided in them both at separate times that Smith had attempted to abduct her. According to the affidavit, Smith approached in his truck and attempted to pull Amber inside, but she got away, running back to her house and going inside. Smith denied the allegation to investigators and stated that he hadn't even been to the Barker house on the 17th. Wanting to dig deeper, detectives asked Smith if he would be willing to be interviewed by the FBI, at which time they would also administer a polygraph examination. While Smith agreed to the meeting and the test, he never showed up. Ultimately, the affidavit passed the judge's requirements and a search warrant for the deceased man's truck was issued. Investigators would later report that a search of the vehicle had shown that the truck had blue cloth seats, blue carpet, and a blue vinyl dashboard. This stood out to them as they noted that unidentified blue fibers were found on the sweater Amber had been wearing the day she vanished. The search also showed that a bungee cord was attached to the bed of the truck near the tailgate, and there were hairs recovered from the passenger and driver's side of the truck. In addition to the blue fibers, police also revealed that they had found vomit on Amber's sweater and a speck of blood on one of her shoes, though it was too small to be tested properly. Unfortunately, from this point forward, the case really began growing cold. In May of '98, 5 months after her disappearance, classmates at James Monroe Elementary School decorated Amber's desk as part of their vigil for her. As part of the ceremony, the students planted a young red bud tree outside of the school in memory of Amber. They made handmade decorations and flowers which were placed around the tree. Bonnie, who was present for the ceremony and to pick up her daughter's belongings from the school, struggled to keep herself from breaking down. 5 months later, on October 14th, the students celebrated what would have been Amber's 11th birthday by decorating the tree with light blue ribbons. Friday, December 18th, marked 1 full year since Amber had vanished, and police were really no closer to finding answers. They acknowledged that they were still working the case, though with the passage of time and Smith's untimely demise, they were operating under the belief that Amber was deceased, and therefore they were mostly searching for her body. Investigators speculated that Smith was likely involved, with his motive being anger and vengeance. Amber's sister had fled with his daughter, and so he struck back by taking her sister. Of course, no one knows with any certainty what, if any, motive Smith may have had for his alleged role in the crime. The results of DNA testing on Amber's clothing and Smith's vehicle hadn't yet returned a year later, and they were also still waiting the results of tests conducted to compare the fibers found on her clothes to the blue fabric of the truck, as well as analysis of the hairs found inside the vehicle. Unfortunately, there was little else to work, and investigators hadn't received new tips in months. Dan Vogel of the FBI explained, quote, "We are trying to make some comparisons to determine if she was in the suspect vehicle. All logical leads have been exhausted. We don't have any leads to investigate. Unless we get a break in the case, there's really nothing for us to do now." End quote. There was little movement on the case going forward. In 1999, Nick Meck created age-progressed photographs showing what Amber might look like at 12, and those images were shared around the city, and some were added to truck drivers' rigs as they traversed the country, hoping to spread awareness of the case under the possibility that Amber was still alive out there somewhere. Despite a desperate hope for answers and a dedicated investigation, the truth and Amber's location would become more and more elusive. Soon, Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years. In June of 2013, 16 years after Amber's disappearance, tragedy would once again strike the Barker family. Following a series of deadly storms in the area, Amber's older sister, Brandy K. Perry, was found deceased with her death initially ruled a drowning. Despite this, Chris Kahn, chief deputy with the Seminole County Sheriff's Office, noted that he didn't believe the death to be an accidental drowning. One reason for thinking this, Deputy Kahn pointed out, was that Brandy's body had been recovered from a ditch 20 feet from the trailer she'd been living in. However, there was no flood damage in that area and no indication that the ditch had ever had any water in it. Deputy Kahn would also note Brandy's injuries were inconsistent with accidental drowning, telling the Oklahoman, quote, "She had some kind of head injury or something like that. Looked like she slipped and fell and hit her head. We just don't believe she's a storm victim. We don't have any reason to suspect foul play at this point, but we're still waiting on the medical examiner to see what their findings are going to be." End quote. Brandy's sister Debbie didn't believe that she had died from an accident, and neither did their mother Bonnie. They cast suspicion towards Brandy's ex-boyfriend, who was reportedly verbally and physically abusive towards the deceased woman. Bonnie went on to state that Brandy had recently moved to that area with the boyfriend, and almost as quickly as they'd arrived, the relationship had gone sour. Debbie noted that the boyfriend had always treated her sister poorly, leading her on and then dumping her and cutting off contact. Reportedly, Brandy was trying to get back to the Oklahoma City area around the time of her death, but had no vehicle and could not afford to travel. Interestingly, during their discussions with the Oklahoman, both Bonnie and Debbie were asked about Amber and the likelihood that Smith had been responsible for her disappearance. For Bonnie, she had previously made it clear that she had no doubt Smith was involved, saying, quote, "I definitely think that he's responsible. I believe there's somebody else involved besides him that knows something." End quote. Debbie, who had had a child with Smith previously, did not agree with her mother's assertion, saying that she didn't think Smith had anything to do with Amber's abduction. She explained, quote, "The guy that's responsible never got charged. He got away with it. He's still alive, too. I told the detective who I thought did it, and he agreed, but he never did anything about it." End quote. Debbie went on to say that she didn't even believe Smith's death was the result of a suicide, but she wouldn't elaborate as to why. When asked for the name of the person she believed did kill her sister, she wouldn't give it, saying only that she had told police and they didn't pursue the lead. The final updates on the case would come in January of 2015, 18 years after Amber's disappearance. On Thursday, January 15th, investigators filed a search warrant requesting DNA samples from an inmate in an Oklahoma prison. According to court papers, lab technicians examining the vomit on Amber's sweater identified what they believed to be ejaculate mixed in with the vomit. Back in '97, they had been unable to do more with their equipment, but retesting in 2015 revealed a partial male DNA profile. Police were seeking and obtained a warrant for the DNA of Forrest J. Rice. Rice, who had also gone by the name Stephen Brent Henley, was close friends with Daniel John Smith at the time of Amber's disappearance. Rice has a long and extensive criminal history in the state of Oklahoma, and while the vast majority of charges and convictions have been for possession, intent to distribute, and intent to manufacture methamphetamine, he does have a few assault and batteries in there. Police noted that they did not think Rice was a suspect, but they did believe he possessed vital information about what happened to Amber the day she vanished. During interviews with investigators, Rice apparently stated that he had been with Smith both the day of the disappearance and the day he died. Interestingly, it's worth noting that someone going by the name of Stephen and claiming to be Smith's best friend had memorials for him placed in the Daily Oklahoman every year or two for several years following Amber's disappearance. it was revealed by News 9 that the Crimes Against Children unit was going over Amber's case with new eyes in hopes of finding something that might lead them to the truth. Court documents filed by investigators revealed 3 names they were looking at in the case: Daniel John Smith, Forrest J. Rice, and Joseph Bishop. If you'll recall, Bishop was present at the Barker home the day of the disappearance and told police that after Amber called, Smith had immediately left the house. Bishop told News 9 that he was dating Amber's sister, Brandy, back in '97. Bishop denied any involvement in the crime and stated his belief that Smith was responsible, though he wasn't sure why he had done it. Investigators also confirmed that while they wanted to speak to Bishop again, they also did not consider him a suspect, just someone who might know more. Sergeant Gary Knight of the Oklahoma City Police Department stated that they were still actively investigating the case. When asked whether or not he believed they would solve it, Knight replied, quote, "That's what we're here to do, to try to find out who's responsible for this kind of crime, hold them accountable, yet also locate the body and at least possibly give the family some closure to be able to bury their child." Investigators believe that someone knows the whole story, or at least enough of the story to put the pieces together. And after all these years, we still want to hear from that person. That information is still vital to the case. End quote. Unfortunately, that person has still not come forward. When last seen, Amber Renee Barker was described as being a white female with brown hair and eyes, standing 5 feet tall and weighing approximately 70 to 80 pounds. Her ears are pierced, and she often goes by the nickname Amby. At the time of her disappearance, she was riding a blue 10-speed bike, which was later recovered. She was dressed in a long-sleeve beige shirt with a brown collar, light black jeans, and a pair of No Excuses brand sneakers. She was last known to have been leaving her friend's house at 3041 Northwest 45th Street and was heading towards her home then at 3119 Northwest 39th Terrace, a distance of 0.6 of a mile. She was last reportedly sighted heading south along North Drexel Boulevard, her usual route home. At the time of her disappearance, Amber was 10 years old, and if alive today, she'd be turning 37 this October. Police would also like any information available about the movements and activities of Daniel John Smith from the time of Amber's disappearance to the time of his death on Monday, December 22nd. Smith's body was found in Ray Trent Park, his vehicle left behind at a convenience store on Sunny Lane Road. Smith had reportedly attempted to abduct Amber previously, frightened the child with his anger, and allegedly left the Barker home as soon as he overheard that Amber was on her way there. Though Smith has never been officially named a suspect, investigators believe he possessed vital information about the child's disappearance and likely abduction and murder. 27 years have passed since Amber disappeared on that short bike ride home from her friend's house. That's 17 years longer than she was known to have been alive. Though police were able to follow a trail of a series of clues, starting with Amber's bike and ending with items of clothing, they were never able to find her. With their only named person of interest committing suicide, much of the hope of solving the case went with him. There remains hope and belief that someone out there has information they've yet to reveal that could finally unravel this haunting mystery, but no one thinks there can be a happy ending. Police are convinced that Amber is deceased and likely has been since within hours of her abduction. Though they continue to investigate, there is little they can do without more information. As for Amber's family, the passage of time has sadly taken several people before they could learn the truth. Both of the child's parents are gone. Her father Robert passing in 2007, while her mother Bonnie went in 2014. Her older sister Brandy Kay died under what some have called unusual circumstances in 2013, but there's been no additional information or follow-up in regard to her cause of death, with it remaining accidental. There has been no new activity on the case since 2015, and whether or not they have done more with the testing of the evidence and comparing DNA is unknown. They do possess a partial male profile. They've just never been able to match it to anyone. Amber was just 10 years old. She had her life stolen away from her, all of her hopes and dreams smashed and shattered, and all that can be done, and all that is left to discover, is the truth. Anyone taking the time to look into the investigation into Amber's disappearance will find themselves confronted by a large series of conflicting details, contrasting statements, and all signs pointing in one direction. It seems apparent that within the first 3 days, police had a fairly good idea of what happened here. Even if they didn't, they had their eyes on the man they believed could provide them with the information that they sought. Assuming they were hot on the trail, they quickly discovered that their only named potential person of interest had disappeared, and with him, the likely truth of Amber's fate. Days later, they find his body in a local park. No note, no explanation, no additional information. Some wonder if his suicide was the result of guilt, deep guilt for what he may have done to Amber, while others wonder if it was a suicide at all. It feels like a case that should have been solved, and it definitely is a case that can be solved. The problem is, the same as it's been from the first moment. Investigators have never had enough evidence to even name a suspect, let alone to arrest or charge anyone. Sure, there's been a decent amount of evidence that points in a direction, or at least suggests an answer, but nothing that can confirm one way or the other. You have to wonder what the problem is with all the forensic testing. You have blue fibers on the victim's clothes, and Smith's truck has blue seats and blue carpet. Why, all these years later, are there no answers one way or the other about whether or not these fibers matched anything in the vehicle? We learn about DNA testing on ejaculate found in the vomit. They develop a partial male profile, but it apparently doesn't match anyone. I'd love to know if they were able to test that against Daniel John Smith, but you'd think if they had, they'd say so one way or the other. Perhaps that's what lends so much frustration to this case. Law enforcement has had very little to say over these past 3 decades. We know forensic testing in '97 was nothing close to what it is today, so it's difficult to understand why more hasn't been learned. When it comes to Amber's clothing, later found heading south along Drexel, all we've heard mention of is the vomit, ejaculate, and a spot of blood on the shoe. I wonder if they've considered using the MVAC on the clothes. It's proven to find solid forensic evidence when all other options have failed. I also wonder if the partial profile is enough to confirm a match, or if it could only be used to rule people out, but not to absolutely identify the suspect. It feels very much like this case could be solved, and we know for certain it could be, if someone would come forward. Instead, they keep quiet about what was likely the sexual assault and murder of a 10-year-old child because reasons. Looking back at the case, as you're very aware, there are no official suspects. Unofficially, it seems pretty clear that almost everyone associated with Amber believes that Daniel John Smith was directly involved, if not the only person involved. He had a criminal history, which included a guilty plea for kidnapping. He was violent with Amber's older sister, who just 18 days prior to the disappearance called the police and reported that Smith had violently assaulted her when she refused to have sex with him. Amber apparently told her father and her brother that Smith tried to force her into his truck the day before her disappearance, and one of her sister's then boyfriends, Joey Bishop, told investigators that Smith was at the house when Amber called, overheard the call, and then immediately left. Smith would later tell police he just drove around drinking and looking for Debbie's car, which is, of course, an alibi that cannot be corroborated. There's no accounting for Smith's whereabouts from the time he left the Barker home until police questioned him, reportedly on Friday the 19th. During that questioning, he admits to being present when Amber called, but denied he had seen or interacted with her after that. When asked to sit for an extended interview with the FBI and a polygraph exam, Smith agrees, but never shows up. When police seek him out after learning more about him, they can't find him. Now, while Smith is never named a suspect, I think it speaks volumes that the police felt justified in going to the media and asking the public to help locate him. You don't generally do that for someone you don't believe was involved. They make the announcement on Sunday afternoon. They locate his truck on Sunday night and they find his body Monday morning. A couple of details about this are mentioned and never followed up on again that just don't make any sense to me. Firstly, it's reported that Smith's truck is found at a gas station convenience store at 7727 South Sunny Lane Road. Every article about this specifies that the vehicle was found less than 1 mile from Smith's body, but that convenience store is over 5 miles from the park in which he was found. Police theorized that Smith had parked his truck and then walked to the park, but why would you choose to walk 5 miles when there were other more convenient locations to just leave your vehicle? I mean, it's not like you're coming back for it. Not to mention, the inmate police wanted DNA from, who was close friends with Smith, Forrest Rice/Steve Henley, told investigators that he was with Smith both on the day of the disappearance and on the day of his death. Smith's body was found at 11:30 a.m. on Monday the 22nd. Was Rice hanging out with him that morning? Was he with him when he went to the park? Did he maybe give him a ride from that convenience store to the park, explaining that 5-mile difference? No one has yet provided answers to any of those questions. Whatever statements Rice made to investigators in 2015 and at any time before or since haven't been revealed, and 9 years later, it doesn't sound like they're going to get anything more out of him. There's been a lot of talk about this being a case that involves more than one person, and frankly, given the information about Smith and Rice, I don't find that hard to believe. I admit some confusion, though, about statements from the family in the years after. Allegedly, Bonnie denied to police that Smith was at the house that day, even though he admitted it. Then she corrects and pivots, saying, well, he was there, but he wasn't there when the call came in, when, again, he told the police he was there when the call came in and he overheard it. I've never understood why Bonnie made these statements. Maybe it was the stress, maybe she was confused, but I don't know. Look, I don't look to impugn anyone's character. I'm not trying to call Bonnie's behaviors into question, and I'm certainly not doubting the grief and trauma experienced by a mother who has lost a child. But the truth is, there's a lot about her that really sticks out to me, and I can't ignore it. Aside from appearing to try to lie about Smith being present in the home that day, I'd like to know why he was there in the first place. And the same goes for Joey Bishop. We know Smith had a bad and violent relationship with Debbie, so much so that she fled the state to get away from him. Bishop told police his relationship with Brandy was on the rocks as well, yet both of these men are hanging out at the family house with Bonnie at 10 to 6 on a random Thursday? I can't begin to fathom why. How long were they there? What were they doing? Were they all hanging out and chatting with Bonnie about being bad to her daughters? I mean, obviously, I'm being pretty sarcastic here, but what's the better answer? A lot of you out there are parents. Many of you have siblings. How much time would you spend hanging out at your own home with people who had been physically and verbally abusive to your daughter, to your son, to your brother or sister? Hell, Amber told her father and her brother that Smith tried to abduct her. She admitted to being desperately afraid of him, and yet the next day, there he is hanging out with mom. I can't help but wonder, did she tell Bonnie about this, or did she feel for one reason or another like it was pointless? Like, even if she had told her, it wouldn't change anything. And if she had told her, would Bonnie have admitted that to the police, or would she have lied about that too? We don't know what went on in that house, and frankly, we probably never will. I get a bad feeling about it, like something just wasn't right there, but I can't put my finger on it. I'd love to know what investigators thought about Bonnie, her relationship with Amber, and the comings and goings of Smith, Bishop, and who knows who else. I don't mean to sound like a jerk about it, but the whole discussion about Amber being afraid to go home that night because she stayed out past her curfew just sounds like complete horseshit to me. I just don't get the impression that there were a lot of hard and tight rules around that house, especially for a child who was reportedly never in trouble and never did anything wrong. It seems more likely if Amber was afraid to go home that night, it was because of who was there rather than anything to do with being late. Sure, it's speculation, but given how little we really know about Amber's day-to-day life, speculation's about all you've got. Moving off Bonnie, you've got Debbie, Amber's sister and Smith's ex, who would later state her beliefs that Smith was innocent in the disappearance and didn't take his own life. While she never expounded on her reasoning behind the latter, she did state that she thought the crime had been committed by someone else, someone she would not name. One could make the assumption that she may have been talking about Rice, but there's no way to know that for certain. Another name that's been knocked around here and there with suspicion is Joey Bishop. At the time of the relationship, he was dating one of Amber's sisters and admitted to police that the relationship was rocky at best. He was also present at the Barker home the night Amber called and said she'd be riding her bike home. In fact, he's the man who told police that Smith was there and left right after the call. Now, to be clear, investigators never said anything about Bishop being involved, only that they wanted to speak with him to try and obtain additional information. What more Bishop might have to offer is unknown, though some aren't so quick to dismiss the possibility that he could have been involved. Much like Smith, he had a relationship with one of Amber's sisters. It wasn't going well. He was at the house that day and overheard the phone call, and he left afterwards as well. Of course, when you add all that up, it's rather interesting, but it does nothing to lend credence towards any kind of a crime. I can't help but wonder, had Daniel John Smith lived, would he have remained the primary person of interest, or would the case have evolved? Now, I'm not going to lie to you, my opinion pretty much lines up with everyone else's. Smith feels like a really solid and the most likely suspect to me, but I can't see past my own biases, and there's a part of me that feels very much like Smith's death is heavily influencing the way I see the case. It makes sense. It fits. Someone feels guilty. They know there's no way of escaping. The police are closing in on them. They have a prior record. They violated their parole, and everybody knows what happens to child abusers and killers in prison. Maybe that's the problem for me. After all these years covering cold cases, it just doesn't feel right when things fit into place. You put your money down on it, ask my opinion, I'll put all my cash on Smith. But I can't deny there's a little voice in the back of my head that wonders about other possibilities. The only one left, which we haven't discussed, is that maybe someone else was involved, known or unknown. A family friend, a member of the family itself, or a complete stranger. I don't think you could completely rule that out, especially when so many people have talked about the likelihood that more than one person was involved. Essentially, Amber was likely to have been taken between 5:50 and 6:30 p.m., assuming Bonnie's times are accurate about searching for her at approximately 6:20. 30 to 40 minutes is plenty of time to abduct a child. I mean, think about how many cases you've heard where it happens in a span of 5 minutes or less. Someone driving by, someone in the area, maybe even someone who knew Amber could have grabbed her or even convinced her to get into their car or truck. I'm assuming the suspect drives a truck because of the fact that Amber's bike was found unmarred at Denniston Park, 14 blocks from her home. It's extremely unlikely she rode her bike there by her own choice. That's something that's always bothered me about this case, though. Why leave the bike behind at the park in the first place? Seems an odd choice to leave a major clue behind for police to discover, which leads to the clothing as well. The way things look, it's almost as if Amber was abducted and the assailant, or someone working with them, was ripping her clothes off and tossing them out the window as they drove. The path heads south, and the last item found, a shoe, is all the way down at Northwest 12th Street, 27 blocks from home. Disturbingly, you'll note that neither Amber's pants or underwear were ever found, leading many to believe that they had to be destroyed for likely containing a lot of forensic evidence. I've often wondered if things happened in reverse. Given the vomit and ejaculate on Amber's sweater, it would make more sense to me if the clothing was thrown out the window as the suspect traveled north, likely after the crime had taken place. Think about it for a moment. The sweater is found at the intersection of Drexel and Northwest 15th, just 2 miles from the Kelly home. The bike is found in Denniston Park at Drexel and Northwest 25th. That's just 0.7 of a mile from the park to the sweater. So, the suspect or suspects grab Amber, put her bike in the park, and then start pulling off her clothes and throwing them out the window immediately? I find it highly unlikely that moments after abducting Amber, her assailants were already leaving ejaculate on her clothing as they're driving down a busy road throwing clothes out the window. Especially considering the time frame between 5:50 and 6:30, it's difficult to accept no one would have seen or heard anything. However, if they throw the clothing out of the window on the way back and maybe even dump the bike last instead of first, they're leaving a trail to nowhere. Hell, given the dates some of the clothing is found and its close proximity to other items, I wouldn't even rule out the possibility that some items might have been discarded on Friday or maybe even as late as Saturday, perhaps overnight when the cops weren't hitting the area so hard. It is kinda strange, though, that all the real solid evidence was located way outside of the original search area. It's almost as if whoever was involved lived nearby. Because if you're talking about a stranger or someone who doesn't live in the area, why the hell would they still be hanging around hours or even days later? Smith had lived in northwestern Oklahoma City for much of his life. Digging into his history shows addresses at apartments all around the area, including several within 2 miles of where Amber lived. Interestingly, if you look into his so-called dear friend Forrest Rice, he also had multiple addresses during the mid to late 90s that were close to Amber. If you go to Google Maps and add in only 3 addresses, Smith's, Rice's, and Amber's, what you'll see is that in 1997, Rice lived 2 miles west of Amber's home and Smith lived 2 miles east. Interestingly, if you mark the locations of all of Amber's clothing that were found and her bike, and then you set your destination as Smith's apartment, the suggested route would take you up Drexel all the way to Northwest 30th Street, at which time you'd turn east. So basically, the suggested route to Smith's apartment would pass all of the locations at which items of Amber's clothing had been found, and just 4 blocks north of where the bike is found, you'd make a turn. Coincidence? Maybe, but I remain convinced the clothing was thrown out on the way back, not the way down. The disappearance of Amber Barker, or more accurately, the probable abduction and murder of Amber Barker, has been at a standstill for decades. Once investigators got their hands on initial evidence and Smith removed himself from the equation, everything sort of became frozen in time. Amber's remains have never been located, whether she's in one of the local parks, buried in a vacant lot, or perhaps was thrown into the Oklahoma River or one of the number of bodies of waters in the surrounding area, no one can say for sure. All we really know is that a little girl with a bright future ahead, a world full of dreams and possibilities, was needlessly taken before her life could even begin. And now she's been gone for nearly 3 times as long as she was ever known to be alive to create memories and to feel and give love. Unfortunately, unless someone comes forward, forensic testing cracks the secret of the unknown DNA or an outright confession is made. The disappearance of Amber Barker will remain open, unsolved, and very cold. If you're looking for more information about the disappearance of Amber Barker, there are many news sites and forums discussing her case. For this episode, the Daily Oklahoman and Tulsa World were the most helpful. Amber is listed in NCMEC, NamUs, the Doe Network, and several other sites. If you have any information about the disappearance of Amber Barker, please contact the Oklahoma City Police Department at 405-297-1129. Her case number is 971-22598. You can also report information anonymously to Crime Stoppers at 405-235-7300 or by visiting their website at okccrimetips.com. What do you believe happened? Tweet me at traceevpod, email me at traceevidencepod@gmail.com, or comment in the Facebook group. Now, I'd like to take a moment to thank our amazing Patreon producers, without whom Trace Evidence would not be possible. Andrew Guarino, Ann M. Bertram, Brutalist, Christine Greco, Crystal J., Danny Renee, Dierthy, Denise Dingsdale, Desiree Laro, Deani Dyson, Jennifer Winkler, Justin Snyder, Kara Moreland, K.Y., Lars Jensen van Gel, Leslie B., Lisa Hobson, Melissa Breckheisen, Nick Mohar Schurz, Roberta Jansen, Ruth, Stacy Finnegan, and Tom Radford. Thank you all so much for your amazing support and for keeping Trace Evidence going forward. This concludes our look into the disappearance of Amber Barker, a devastating and heartbreaking case that's so very solvable if only the truth could be found out. I also want to thank all of you for your patience over this last 6 weeks. I was very sick with food poisoning, which then led into a major stomach virus, but I'm finally through it and back in the office and doing the work, and I can't wait to get more episodes out. So I want to thank you all for listening, for supporting the show, and I'll see you next time with another unsolved case on the next episode of Trace Evidence.